I've shared some of my family history with you before. Uh, so bear with me if you've heard this before. It helps to make a point that I'm wanting to go to in the sermon this morning. My name, my given name, and I haven't shared this through the years with many people, so you're my trusted folks. But my given name is Roderick Ross IV. I didn't want people to know that because they would tease me about it, so don't tease me about it, okay? I go by Rick for a reason. And I've even had people ask me, where do you get Rick out of Roderick? Duh, Roderick. But my dad and granddad went by Rod. So I'm the fourth. My great-granddad, Roderick Ross, lived in Inverness, Scotland, which is on the northeast coast of Scotland. They're on the North Sea, not far from Loch Ness. Maybe the monster was part of my family heritage. I don't know. But he was a stonemason. And in the 19th century, Scottish stonemasons were sought all over the world. It was a very lucrative trade. And my great-grandfather, Roderick Ross, decided he wanted to go see what the world had to offer. And so he went to Australia, and he went to New Zealand, he went to South Africa. In fact, he got caught up in the Second Boers War at the end of the 19th century. Went to Canada, I guess all the Commonwealth countries pretty much. And early in the 20th century, he wired my great-grandmother and said, I found the perfect place to live, Dallas, Texas. Dallas was beginning to boom. I think he saw a lot of work opportunities there. So he moved his family. My granddad came over. My granddad was born in Scotland, came to the United States in 1906. And my great-granddad built a house in Oak Cliff. They were the second family in Oak Cliff. They had to take a raft across the river back then. And I tell you all of that to kind of say, oh, and he died of tuberculosis, which was called stonecutter's disease. He died in his 50s. I know a little bit about my great-grandfather's legacy, and it's an interesting legacy. It's a legacy of adventure. But there's a part of my great-grandfather's legacy that I don't know anything about. I don't know if he had any level of faith. I have nothing to show me that. And so I want to talk this morning a little bit. It's kind of just going to be throughout the lesson, but it's just the idea of leaving a legacy. So we left Samson last week with his hair shaved off and his eyes gouged out, and he's bound in shackles. He's grinding grain. You might remember at one point Samson destroyed all the grain fields of the Philistines, and now he finds himself grinding their grain. It's kind of ironic. He never dreamed that his life would come to this. A popular misconception about Samson is that although he had a few chinks in his armor, he was really an Old Testament superhero who fell a victim to Delilah. I don't buy all of that. I think Samson knew exactly what he was doing. And if we're honest with the text, a more accurate assessment, a more accurate picture of Samson is that he was self-centered and he was vengeful and he was driven by his lust. The beauty of the story of Samson is that even though that's the way he chose to live, God still used him to fulfill God's purposes. And so with that said, there is this tension that exists for me. Because there is a difference between the story of Samson in Judges in what we read about Samson in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 11. And I've struggled with this week. But here's what it says. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. How do we explain this apparent contradiction between what is said in Judges about Samson and what is said about him in the New Testament? I'm going to just let that simmer on the back burner for you for a while, and we'll come back to it in just a few minutes. So, as we left Samson last week, there was this glimmer of hope. When it said in verse 22 of chapter 16, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Again, let's make it clear, Samson's hair was not magic. The power was not in his hair. His hair represented a vow that had been made to God. When God removed himself from Samson, Samson's strength was also removed. God had revealed his purposes for Samson's life before Samson had even been conceived. He was to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. And God had been fulfilling that promise in the life of Samson despite the choices Samson made. Samson did nearly everything wrong. But God was able to use even those messed up circumstances in his life to bring about his will. And so when we read that Samson's hair is beginning to grow back, it's really a way that the writer's letting us know that God's at work. So let's read on. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. It appears at this point that Dagon, the god of the Philistines, has won. And so the rulers of the Philistines throw this great celebration. Now remember, they've been fighting Samson for over 20 years, and they have yet to win a battle. Even when they had him outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Even when he was in the city of Gaza and they had the city surrounded. But now they have him right where they want him. He's blind, he's shackled, he's captive. Samson's their trophy. Samson's the object of their ridicule. His life choices have tarnished his name. I don't know if there's anything more humiliating than to be publicly mocked. But Samson not only has tarnished his name, Samson has tarnished the name of Yahweh. Thousands of Philistines are shouting, "Dagon, our God, has destroyed or beaten Yahweh." And he's delivered Samson into our hand. And so it says these thousands of people are in high spirits, which probably means they were drunk. And they begin calling for Samson to be brought out to entertain them. Now, we don't know what that means. The writer doesn't tell us. I kind of get the impression it had something to do with him now being weak. So they were probably teasing him. They were probably requesting that he do some feats of strength, and he couldn't do them. And every time they would laugh and jeer and poke fun at him. Samson's paying a high price for his life choices. Then it says, let's go to the next slide, please. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. I want you to notice all the rulers of the Philistines are there. We're talking thousands of people in this ancient Colosseum. It's a full house. It's standing room only. The picture I get would be similar to when our president delivers his State of the Union address. And you have gathered there all the senators, all the congressmen, the Supreme Court, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Everyone is there. Except in the United States, we have what's called the designated survivor. Every time the president delivers that speech, there's someone who has been selected, a leader, who's placed in a bunker somewhere in the event that some disaster were to happen and take them all out in one fell swoop. The Philistines didn't do that. Samson has this servant. Actually, in Hebrew, it suggests it was a young boy, a young man. He has this young man lead him between the two pillars that are supporting that place. And no one thinks anything about that. Hey, he's blind. We automatically assume sometimes that means he's weak. He's blind, he's weak, he's nothing, there's no reason to be concerned about him. He's helpless. If he had had sight, I doubt they would have let him anywhere close to those pillars. But get this. God's grace has taken the results of Samson's failures and is going to use them for a great victory. Because it says, then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson prays, which, by the way, is always a good thing. He prays, and it appears that now, in his blindness, Samson is now able to see more clearly than perhaps he's ever seen. There's a newfound humility that's evidenced here. He calls out to him, Yahweh Adonai, which means Sovereign Lord. He acknowledges now that God's in charge, that he's dependent upon God. We've never seen this side of Samson before. He acknowledges his dependence upon God. And he asks him to remember me, as if he recognizes, God, you have every right at this point to ignore me, but please remember me. It's a very different Samson than the one we've been reading about in past weeks, isn't it? Last time he prayed, he was pretty much demanding that God give him water. Now he comes in a very humble way. And yet, even having said that, this prayer is far from ideal, isn't it? I mean, he wants his strength to return. Why does he want his strength to return? Does he say so that I can give you glory through it? No, he says so that I can get revenge. Take heart in this, though, brothers and sisters. I mean, this ought to encourage us. Even though Samson's prayer is far from perfect, God still hears his prayer, and God still acts on it. That's good news, isn't it? It's merely yet another instance of God, in spite of Samson's flaws, fulfilling the promise that he had made before Samson was even conceived. So verse 29 says, "Then Samson reached toward the two central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel for 20 years. I want you to imagine that horrible scene when Samson's family comes to that site and they're digging through the rubble and there's thousands of corpses as they're looking for the corpse of Samson. Samson's life is now over. His legacy is set. He is pretty much the person that we read about in Judges 13 to 16. And nothing can change that now. He is a man who resisted God at nearly every step in his life. That's part of his story. Such a promising beginning. Such a tragic ending. And still, God fulfilled his purposes through Samson. In one of my earlier messages on Samson, I brought out a comparison between Samson and Jesus in their birth stories, and there's several similar things. There's several parallels that we find there. But even in this final chapter of Samson's life, we see some parallels between Samson's death and the death of Jesus. For instance, both Samson and Jesus were betrayed by friends for money. In Samson's case, it wasn't just a friend, it was his lover. Both of them were handed over to foreign powers who occupied the land. Both of them were tortured and chained and publicly mocked and taunted. Both of them gained victory over their enemies in their deaths. Samson stretched out his arms and pushed against the pillars, securing victory. Jesus stretched out his hands and took the nails so that you and I can have victory. But here is one huge difference. When Samson was buried, he stayed buried. And so we come to the end of his story in the book of Judges. But as we've seen, it's not the last word about Samson in our Bible. He's listed there among the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. I want to read this passage again. It says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies." So Samson is mentioned here with three other judges. Well, really, Barak's not a judge. He was in the story of Deborah. But basically three other judges: Gideon, Barak, and Jephthah. When you read the book of Judges, with the exception of Deborah and a couple of the judges that are maybe just mentioned in one sentence, every one of the judges were deeply, and I mean deeply, flawed individuals. Jephthah, this guy sacrificed his only daughter, his only child, because of a rash vow that he made, where if he had known the word of God, he even had a way of getting out of that vow. And God wouldn't have held him to it to begin with. Gideon spends time worshiping idols. And Samson, he's just the Old Testament frat boy. And so I've struggled all week with how to rectify these two accounts of Samson. I can't figure out how to spin it. You know, historians have a way of glossing over the things that we don't want to know about our heroes. But these flaws of Samson's, my goodness, they're pretty glaring, aren't they? His story certainly doesn't end happily ever after. And so I think it will help us if we have a better understanding of what the writer of the Hebrew letters' purpose was in writing what he wrote. Because he's focused throughout his letter. This is the background. He is writing to Jews who have become Christian. And now they're beginning to suffer some persecution because of this Christian faith they have embraced. And many of them are thinking about giving up. They're thinking about giving up on Jesus and going back to Judaism. And so the writer of the Hebrew letter is writing to encourage them to hang in there. Don't give up. And he gives concrete examples of people in their own past who have not given up, who have kept the faith, as he speaks here in chapter 11, who gained what was promised. In Samson, God had made a promise to his parents before he was even conceived. And the writer speaks there about weakness that's turned to strength. And we certainly see that in this last story of Samson, don't we? He's weak, and yet God turns him, he returns his strength. And so, God's promises were fulfilled. And this is what the Hebrew writer is wanting us to see. God is a promise-making, promise-keeping God. And so he wants his audience, and he wants you and me to understand that God has made some promises to us through Jesus Christ. And when we become frustrated, and when we face difficulties in our lives and we're wanting to walk away or we're thinking about giving up, the writer of Hebrews is saying, don't do it. You remember that you have a faithful, promise-keeping God. He's going to do what he said he's going to do. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13 says this. Wrap your mind around this. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Aren't those awesome words? And they're words intended to encourage you and me. A God who remained faithful and gracious and in relationship with a scamp like Samson, hey, he's going to be faithful to you and me. So trust in his promise. Now, let's not make Samson into a hero. Let's not make Samson into a model for our young men. Samson lived a life pursuing the indulgence of his own flesh. He cared too little about God. He cared too little about Israel. He cared too little about what he had been called to do, his divine gifting and his divine calling. Actually, Samson is a good study of how not to live as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And yet, we remember him. We remember him for this glimmer of faith in the final moments of his life, when he humbly cried out to God to use him one last time. And so I return to where I began, about leaving a legacy. You know, I love telling those stories about my great-grandfather, and I really wish I could find out even more about his life. But it's just kind of sad to me that I don't know anything about his faith. And I'm wondering if maybe it wouldn't be a good thing for you and me to ask ourselves, what kind of legacy are we leaving? Because you know you're leaving a legacy. What are you going to be remembered for? How interested you were in sports? What TV shows you like? And I'm not trying to lay some heavy guilt trip on anybody about this. I'm just saying there are priorities in life. Could there be anything more important than the legacy of faith that we leave? Could there be anything more important than 3 generations from now for people to be able to say, my great-great-grandfather or grandmother was a Jesus follower, and they were so caught up in him. They wanted to honor him with their lives. They pursued his kingdom with ferociousness. They loved the community of faith. Could there be any greater legacy to leave than that? How will you be remembered? I love this verse. It's actually 2 verses from Psalm 112. This says, praise the Lord. Blessed are those who fear the Lord, who find great delight in his command. Surely the righteous will never be shaken. They will be remembered forever. That's a legacy. We're going to sing a song to encourage anyone who might want to respond this morning for prayer or to meet with the elders in room 102 to pray for something more specific or to come and be added to Jesus in baptism. So we encourage you. I really want to encourage you, though, to consider the legacy that you're leaving. But we encourage you if you need to respond right now as we stand and sing.